Do you think the scariest part of a long-haul flight is turbulence or maybe a rough landing? What if I told you that the real danger isn't something you can feel at all, but an invisible ceiling where the air itself simply stops being enough to hold a 200-ton aircraft off the ground? Today, we're climbing to 12,000 meters, or roughly 40,000 feet, the altitude where commercial aviation quietly runs out of room to make mistakes. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the skin of the plane is slowly stretching around you right now, why the engines can go completely silent without warning, and why, if something goes wrong up here, you would have only about 15 seconds to do anything about it. Let's find out why this one number, 12,000 meters, matters so much. Picture yourself in your seat, watching clouds drift by below the wing. It feels calm, it feels safe. But just beyond that thin sheet of aluminum, the rules that keep a plane in the sky are being pushed right up to their limit. At sea level, air is thick and forgiving. Up here, it's almost a quarter as dense, and the pressure outside has dropped to about a fifth of what it is on the ground. The wings aren't really resting on a cushion of air anymore. They're gliding over something closer to a thin, brittle sheet of ice, and there's very little room left for error. So, what happens when a pilot notices the plane starting to sink at this height? The instinct is to push the throttles forward, because at this altitude, that's really the only tool left. You need faster air moving over the wings to make up for how thin that air has become. But here's the trap hidden inside that solution. To stay aloft in air this sparse, the aircraft has to hold a very specific, very narrow speed. Slow down by even a handful of kilometers per hour, and the wings stop producing enough lift to fight gravity. The airplane doesn't ease into trouble. It can lose control surprisingly fast. Now, you'd assume the fix is obvious. Just speed up a little to stay safe. Except at this height, that option is closed off too. Flying too fast at 40,000 feet brings its own set of dangers, and so pilots are boxed in from both directions, too slow on one side and too fast on the other. Engineers have a name for this uncomfortable gap, and it's one of the more chilling terms in aviation. They call it the coffin corner. It's the point where the minimum safe speed and the maximum safe speed practically converge into a single number, leaving almost no margin between flying and falling. Just how tight does that margin get? On some aircraft near this altitude, the buffer between stalling and overspeeding can shrink to something like 10 kilometers an hour. Imagine trying to keep a car balanced on a tightrope where drifting a few centimeters in either direction sends you off the edge. That's essentially what pilots are managing, except at cruising altitude, in freezing temperatures with hundreds of lives depending on getting it right. And speaking of freezing, the cold up here changes the physics even further. At around minus 60 degrees Celsius, sound itself travels differently through the air. Near the ground, sound moves at roughly 1,220 kilometers an hour. Up at cruising altitude, that number drops to somewhere around 1,060. Why should that matter to a passenger sipping a drink in seat 14C? Because as the plane cruises at its normal speed, the air flowing over the curved top of the wing can locally reach that lower speed of sound, even while the plane itself is nowhere near supersonic. When that happens, tiny shock waves ripple across the wing's surface, and those shock waves can interfere with the control surfaces the pilots depend on to steer. If that interference gets bad enough, something unsettling can occur. An invisible force can start lifting the tail of the aircraft, which pushes the nose downward. Pilots call this getting tucked into a dive, and it can happen with startling speed. Because different sections of the same wing are experiencing slightly different airspeeds at once, the whole aircraft can lose its balance in a way that's genuinely difficult to correct, even with modern instruments. Thankfully, airlines build enormous safety margins into every flight plan specifically so crews never get anywhere near this edge. Pilots have to point the nose toward the Earth and descend several kilometers before there's enough oxygen for a restart to even have a chance of working. This exact scenario played out in 2004 over Missouri, when a business jet was pushed to its maximum service ceiling and both engines quit at once, starved of oxygen. The crew attempted to relight them 4 separate times without success, and only after descending several kilometers into thicker air did the engines finally catch. But that descent brought its own danger, because dropping altitude quickly builds up speed fast, and speed is exactly what can send an aircraft straight back into that coffin corner we talked about earlier. Solve one problem at this altitude, and you can easily create another. While the engines are fighting for air, the fuselage around you is fighting a very different battle, and it's happening on every single flight, not just the dangerous ones. Did you know the body of a large airliner actually swells slightly every time it climbs to cruising altitude? It's completely unavoidable, baked into the physics of pressurized flight. Inside the cabin, pressure is kept at a comfortable level, roughly equivalent to a few thousand feet of elevation. Outside, at 40,000 feet, pressure has dropped to a small fraction of that. That difference forces the aluminum skin of the aircraft to expand outward by a noticeable amount on every climb, then contract again on descent. Repeat that stretching and shrinking thousands of times over an aircraft's working life, and the metal starts to remember every cycle. Engineers call this material fatigue, and it tends to concentrate around weak points like window frames and door seals, exactly where microscopic cracks are most likely to begin. In the extreme cold of cruising altitude, aluminum also becomes noticeably more brittle, closer in behavior to glass than to the flexible metal you'd expect on the ground. If a crack in the fuselage ever grows past a certain size, just a matter of millimeters, the whole structure can fail catastrophically, venting cabin air outward in an instant. It's one of the central reasons aircraft eventually get retired long before they physically wear out in any obvious way, and why every airframe goes through relentless, scheduled inspection throughout its life. The fuel sitting in the wings is dealing with its own strange behavior up here too. At 12,000 meters, kerosene doesn't act the way it does in a fuel can back on the ground. Under such low outside pressure, it can genuinely start to boil, releasing bubbles of vapor into the fuel lines. If one of those bubbles ever makes it to the engine, the flame can go out almost instantly. To stop that from happening, engineers install pumps directly inside the fuel, tanks that keep the kerosene pressurized to several atmospheres, forcing it to behave like a liquid instead of turning into foam. That's also part of the reason aircraft wings are built so thick. They're not just aerodynamic shapes, they're sealed pressure vessels holding thousands of liters of fuel that has to survive temperatures around -60 degrees without freezing solid. Special additives are blended into jet fuel specifically to stop ice crystals from clogging the fine filters that feed the engines. Without that chemistry, a flight at this altitude could grind to a halt within minutes as the fuel system simply seizes up. Then there's a threat that has nothing to do with engines, wings, or fuel at all. It comes from space. At 12,000 meters, the protective blanket of Earth's atmosphere is thin enough that cosmic radiation passes through the cabin and through the passengers inside it far more freely than it would at ground level. A single long-haul flight can expose you to a dose of radiation roughly comparable to a medical scan, which sounds manageable for a passenger, but it's a genuine headache for the electronics running the aircraft. Microchips are extremely sensitive to these high-energy particles arriving from deep space. Every so often, a stray cosmic ray strikes a memory cell inside a flight computer, with just enough precision to flip a single bit of stored data, turning a 0 into a 1. It sounds almost too strange to be real, yet it's a documented phenomenon, and it's believed to be responsible for unexplained glitches and false error messages in onboard systems over the years. Shielding an aircraft against this with something like lead is completely out of the question, since the extra weight alone would make the plane too heavy to get off the ground. Instead, engineers build in triple redundancy, running the same calculations across 3 separate computers so that if cosmic radiation corrupts one, the other 2 can outvote the error and keep the aircraft flying straight. Automation brings its own risks at this altitude too, and not always in the way you'd expect. Modern autopilots are remarkably capable, but up here they're operating right at the ragged edge of their design limits. If the sensors on the nose of the aircraft ice over, even briefly, they can start feeding false speed data into the cockpit. The system might interpret that bad data as the plane losing airspeed and respond by pitching the nose upward to try to climb, which, at 12,000 meters, is exactly the wrong move and can trigger a stall almost immediately. In trying to save the aircraft from a danger that was never really there, the automation can steer it straight into one that is. This isn't just a theoretical worry. In 2009, over the Atlantic Ocean, severe icing disabled an aircraft's speed sensors, and the confusion that followed between what the computer believed and what was actually happening contributed to a tragic loss of control near this same dangerous altitude band. It's a hard lesson in how fragile the partnership between human judgment and automated systems can become when the physics around them leaves almost no margin for error. That's a large part of why many airlines now discourage pilots from disengaging automation at extreme altitude in the first place. Human reflexes, as sharp as they are, tend to be too blunt an instrument for corrections that sometimes need to be measured in single kilometers per hour. Naturally, you might be wondering if anything actually flies higher than this and gets away with it. The answer is yes, but not in the world of commercial travel. Specialized military reconnaissance aircraft can climb to altitudes more than twice as high as a typical airliner, into air that's only a tiny fraction as dense as what we breathe on the ground. Getting there comes at a steep price. Pilots have to wear full pressure suits because without one, exposure to such thin air can cause gases in the bloodstream to expand dangerously, a threshold known among specialists as the Armstrong limit. Fly high enough and the sky overhead actually turns black even in the middle of the day, with stars visible right through the canopy. It's an extraordinary environment, but it's completely unsuited to hauling hundreds of passengers safely and affordably, which is exactly why commercial aviation stays well below it. All of which brings us to the most serious number in this entire story. If the cabin were ever to lose pressure suddenly at this height, how much time would you actually have to react? The honest answer is about 15 seconds, and that number isn't an exaggeration for dramatic effect. It's a hard biological limit. At 12,000 meters, outside pressure is so low that your lungs stop pulling oxygen into your blood the way they normally would, Instead, the pressure difference can actually start dragging oxygen back out of your bloodstream and into the air around you. Blood oxygen levels can crash towards zero in a matter of seconds. What makes this especially frightening is that you likely wouldn't feel it happening. There's often no panic, no gasping, just a strange, fleeting sense of calm right before consciousness slips away entirely. That's precisely why oxygen masks on every commercial flight drop automatically the instant cabin pressure fails, rather than waiting for a crew member to hand them out. By the time someone might lose fine motor coordination, there's no guarantee they could reliably reach up and put a mask on themselves. There's also a second danger buried inside sudden decompression. Gases dissolved in the blood, and body tissue can begin expanding rapidly as outside pressure drops. A condition similar to what divers experience when they surface too quickly. Without specialized protective gear, it's an extremely difficult situation to survive, and it's one more reminder that no matter how advanced the aircraft is, the person inside it is still bound by the same fragile biology as anyone standing on solid ground. So, given everything we've just gone through, the coffin corner, the flame-out risk, the fatigue building invisibly in the fuselage, the cosmic rays flipping bits in flight computers, why do we keep flying up here at all? Why not just stay lower where the air is thick and forgiving and none of this is a concern? The answer really comes down to economics. Down at 3 to 5 kilometers, the air is dense enough to act almost like a brake against the aircraft, and pushing through it at cruising speed burns dramatically more fuel, roughly 3 times as much by some estimates. Tickets would cost more, flights would take longer, and airlines simply couldn't operate the way they do today. 12,000 meters turns out to be close to the sweet spot, high enough that air resistance has dropped off substantially, but not so high that there isn't still enough oxygen to keep the engines burning cleanly. Every single day, millions of people climb into this hostile, invisible environment and land again without incident, mostly because generations of engineers have spent decades quietly mapping out exactly where the danger lies and building systems to stay far away from it. The next time you're cruising along at altitude, glancing out at the clouds below, it's worth remembering just how much careful science is holding that thin metal tube steady, and just how narrow the margin really is at the edge of where a plane can fly at all. Thanks so much for watching. Like and subscribe if these subjects interest you, and I'll see you in the next one.